People often wonder what our world would be like if the Roman Empire had not fallen and the Middle Ages had not existed in human history. Understandably, this question often turns into something really stupid along the lines of if grandma had a dick, she'd be grandpa. Yeah, there's always this element. But in general, this kind of discussion can be useful for our analysis of the historical process. And sometimes it is also just an interesting pastime, which explains the emergence of a large number of works of fiction that flirt with this theme in one way or another. Sometimes directly, because there is a whole genre of alternate history. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about the common mistakes that people make when thinking about what if Rome never fell, and also about the problems you almost guaranteed to encounter in works of the alternate history genre, which can take many forms. Also, I'd like to show what repulses me personally in these works that discuss alternate Rome of the future or the Roman Empire that exists in the 20th century. Because quite often, any encounter with a work of alternate history on the subject of ancient Rome is horrifying and disgusting. Even very talented writers have an extremely distorted view of the civilization of antiquity. I basically shun any alternate history works of fiction about Rome. I just read the synopsis and go like, no, this is just wrong and outright insulting. Like the most famous work in this genre, Ridley Scott's Gladiator, where they kill Commodus early in his reign. Usually, the problems of the authors come from the fact that you simply can't be an expert on everything. That's okay. Actually, writers, screenwriters, directors, and so on often don't need to research the material too much. Many are able to get to the heart of things and create works that are at least reminiscent of the truth. But there's a bigger problem here. In the process of researching material, writers, and any of us, because we're not just talking about writers, we're talking about anyone who, in one way or another, wonders what if grandma had a dick. Well, people often operate with material that distorts antiquity, like historical pop literature, children's books, and so on. Even serious works very often interpret the facts wrongly, relying on a school of thought developed a few hundred years ago, sometimes an obsolete school of thought. When people simply did not understand the nature of many things, for example, how the water supply worked or why would anyone build amphitheaters. Plus, they followed the propaganda of the church, which declared the ancient civilization a weird society of degenerates, who, yes, could build cyclopean structures and could philosophize, but in general, they persecuted mythical Christians, did not know the true faith, and spent all their days in homosexual orgies and ate children alive. Let's start with the picture, because sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. Take a look at the cover of this book. Yes, generally speaking, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but come on, this is just insane. Three figures on crosses made of metal overlooking the modern city with its skyscrapers and stuff. This cover represents half of all of the problems with fiction focused on the alternate history of Rome. The book itself is set in the early 21st century. Rome still has slavery, a strange version of gladiatorial combat exists, etc. And they crucify people, obviously. This is just a deep misunderstanding of how technical progress works, how societies and cultures change, and what the society of ancient Rome was. Have I read this book? No. I've read the synopsis. And I will never read something like this because this is nonsense. It is unreadable. And it is kind of insulting because it promotes false and malignant ideas about antiquity and, once again, about the historical process in general. Obviously, there are decent books by talented authors, like this famous Roma Eterna by Robert Silverberg, uh, which is quite enjoyable work, a collection of short stories. But it has a number of fundamental problems, even if Silverberg is sometimes quite on point. Let's discuss some of the biggest problems and misconceptions which plague any discussions about this "what if Rome never fell" thing. I will address five main issues, so there will be five main chapters in this video because we need some kind of structure, and it is easier to discuss something when we have some kind of an outline. And the first thing I'd like to address is the concept of fall of Rome itself. The fall of Rome. If we're discussing the subject of what if Rome never fell, first of all, we need to figure out when and why it fell exactly. And the main problem is that we don't know. There are several more or less legitimate theories on why and how it happened. Also, there was no fall of Rome event. All of the dates for the fall of Rome were made up by historians so they could advance their theories, which I discussed in this video. There's a link in the corner. So when you hear stuff about the fall of Rome in the year 476, that's just nonsense. Or when you hear about the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, who technically wasn't even the emperor. And then we also had the eastern part of the empire, and we had numerous successor states, including the state that was actually called the Holy Roman Empire. We still have some kind of successor states up to this day, which kind of may lead us to the idea that Rome actually never fell at all. But then again, we all understand that we don't really discuss the fall of one particular country. We actually discuss the demise of the civilization of classical antiquity, which actually happened, and the reasons are debated up to this day. It complicates everything, and if you write alternate history fiction, makes the task even more complex. Fortunately, usually writers have enough knowledge of the period to figure out some logical points of divergence. A point of divergence is this event when some alternative thing happens and it creates a new timeline. If you write fiction, you usually need more than one point of divergence, more than one event. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but if we take a look at, for example, Roma Eterna, the biggest book on alternate history of Rome, we can see that initial point of divergence there is absolutely hilarious and has no real impact on the majority of the events. Silverberg essentially starts his fix-up novel with the idea that the exodus from Egypt never happened. Moses failed to lead his people out of the country and drowned in the Red Sea. I obviously have a separate short video about Exodus as well. Because Exodus is a myth. It is not a historical event. It never happened. You cannot create a decent point of divergence in place of the event that never happened. But since the book is mostly about Rome and Exodus wasn't relevant for her history, Silverberg has to go through the actual historical material and find new points of divergence. More than one, actually. Because you change one thing, but then you have some historical characters popping out and trying to do what they were supposed to do in the original historical timeline. So you're trying to do something with them again. Which is a problem in itself, just like the attempts to reinterpret numerous later historical events and squeeze them into a narrative about this alternative Rome. But we're gonna talk about it a bit later, because it is mostly a question of technological progress. A thing that writers and the general crowd get very, very wrong. But as I said, usually writers can find at least one logical point of divergence. I believe even the author of Romanitas quite correctly found the divergence point somewhere around Pertinax. Silverberg finds the main point of divergence for Rome's history after Commodus as well, although later he still has some kind of the crisis of the third century and mentions later emperors, which is a debatable idea. But overall, if we're discussing the fall of Rome, we shouldn't pay too much attention to Romulus Augustulus or something like that. Classical antiquity was derailed by the crisis of the third century, and then pretty much everything went downhill. And frequently, the sources for later periods, including the third century itself, is a joke. In many ways, the actual fall of Rome was triggered by the Severan dynasty, technological progress. So, this is probably the main thing that authors, the general public, and sometimes even historians get incredibly wrong. The civilization of antiquity didn't have exactly the same pattern of technological progress or any kind of progress as the civilization of the modern era. It is also hard to make comparisons because everything is built upon the foundations of antiquity, so the modern age wasn't developing everything from scratch. It is more or less the same civilization, but after the cultural nuclear apocalypse. Long story short, generally speaking, the modern civilization reached the same level of development only in the 19th century. But there are numerous exceptions, obviously. For example, apparently there was no printing press in ancient Rome. So, what alternate history authors really like to do, even the good ones, is well, they assume that if Rome never fell, the progress would look more or less the same, only with some minor differences. No, we can't. We can debate on how it all could have looked, but it is more or less safe to say that we'd have the internet and satellites at least a few centuries early. This probably calls for a separate video. The problem is actually deeper because we're interested not only in scientific progress per se, we're also interested in the development in general, development of public institutions, concepts, ideas, etc. And overall culture. Some writers pretend that antiquity was kind of like the Middle Ages, but with marble statues. No, this is simply wrong. Now, the number of variables in the equation is obviously huge, so we cannot know what could have happened along the way, even if the crisis of the third century never happened. We had no Middle Ages, and the most advanced culture on Earth could continue on its course. Yes, it could survive till modern times in one form or another, because, in fact, it did survive in one form or another. Although this idea that the Roman Empire controls all the world in the 20th century, and you can find this idea in fiction, well, it is very questionable. But we can speculate that yes, they could advance everything you can in terms of construction and technology in a reasonably short amount of time. They could finally invent the printing press in a couple of centuries and create proper mass media, because this is the main point, actually, which means a better state of sources and extension of the system of education, which was quite good in the first place, and scientific progress that doesn't have weird religious barriers, since the proper Roman population was frequently quasi-atheistic. A gradual abolishment of slavery, probably a transition to proper monarchy, at least for some period of time. Blah, 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 blah. We can do this all day. It's all very theoretical. But the thing is, people usually ignore technological and cultural progress because they have false notions about Roman civilization and the magnitude of the utter barbarism which followed its collapse. So if Rome survives in some reasonably stable form, that doesn't mean that, let's put it this way, the starting point of this alternative Rome is the 3rd century level of technology. It is more like the 18th and 19th century level of technology in most of the fields. Although, once again, as I've mentioned before, the curve of progress was different in ancient Rome. You have 19th century level here, and then you have 14th century level there. Could they build the space station on the Earth's orbit in the 9th century? Well, yeah, they could. But then again, if grandmother had a dick, she'd be grandfather. Slavery. Slavery is an incredibly complex subject, but in short, people usually have a huge amount of misconceptions about slavery in antiquity and in ancient Rome in particular. People were told weird and frequently deliberately misleading stories about slavery in this period. And it seems that the majority of speculations about this hypothetical Rome of the future is influenced by absolutely horrible misconceptions and deeply flawed depictions of ancient Rome in popular culture. And it becomes especially nonsensical when we are dealing with contemporary works of fiction produced in the framework of, let's call it, Anglo American culture. It is essentially influenced by Hollywood and American ideas that repeating slavery is bad 5 times a day keeps the doctor away. Slavery in ancient Rome was very different from slavery in the United States. Well, in fact, slavery in the United States was quite different even from the picture an average guy on the street has in mind. The authors routinely make a huge deal out of slavery in ancient Rome, like it was a backbone of Roman society and almost a unique feature. Well, yes, it was quite unique indeed, but mostly because it was significantly more humane compared to probably any other region of the world at the time. But almost any discussion, any work of alternate fiction will feature something about slavery. Come on, there wasn't even an episode of Star Trek about some Rome-inspired planet which reached roughly 20th century level of development with slavery. Roman ideas about slavery were quite progressive. If Rome would have stayed on tracks, so to speak, it is entirely possible that they would have gradually abolished slavery much earlier than any other country of the modern era. It is absolutely self-evident. Creating a work of fiction where Rome still has slavery in the 20th century is simply ridiculous. It is even ridiculous if we're talking about the hypothetical 15th century. And how this slavery is presented, how slavery works, is usually simply weird. It is weird and fundamentally wrong even in historical fiction, especially in the movies. As I've said, it is a separate and very complex subject, but very, very briefly, let's point out some of the main misconceptions. Slavery in Rome was in many ways close to serfdom. No, you couldn't just do whatever you want with a household slave. You know, like kill and torture for no reason. Actually, most people wouldn't do it even if they legally could. Not because they're good, but just for practical reasons. It is a waste of money. It's a bit like, say, you have an average salary, you're buying a new car, and you go like, and now I'm gonna crash it and then set it on fire. Wahaha! I'm a bad boy, and also I'm, insane. The slaves could take their masters to the court. Like, yeah, a slave could sue their owner. And they were not considered slaves for the time of the trial. Some slaves even sued their owners over their manumission. The owner sets the slave free, and the slave is like, you have no right. I want to remain enslaved. I worked for you all these years, and now you're kicking me out of the house. I have nowhere to go, and I should look for employment so that I don't starve. And owners indeed tried to release slaves when possible. It was frequently more beneficial to maintain a patron-client relationship with your freedman or a freedwoman. The person in question was still tied in many ways to the previous owner, even had the name of the owner, quite literally like a member of the extended family. It was more productive, and there was a lot of upward mobility in Roman society. Children of the former slaves even could become emperors at some point. Speaking of this upward mobility and manumission, people frequently don't understand that slave labor is not very effective. It is effective in certain cases and under specific circumstances, like clearing the forests in subtropical climate. But you don't want slaves to build your house. You want professional builders for obvious reasons. You don't want slaves on a galley. I mention this because there is this stereotype of the galley slave. People who are not specialists and people who work for food, well, most of the time, they're not very effective workers. Did Romans understand this? Of course they did. And then we also have different types of slaves, which authors, filmmakers, etc. just bundle into one category. There's a huge difference between a household slave and a prisoner of war, or, just a prisoner. These types of slaves exist even now, but nobody calls them slaves, even if technically they are. They show in the movies sometimes how brave Spartacus, or some other guy, releases slaves from a stone quarry. Oh, what a great accomplishment of a great abolitionist. Well, if somebody stages an attack on a prison, kills the guards, and releases all the people there, usually it is not seen as a heroic act. Or, you can also release all the prisoners of war during the war and let them roam your countryside. That's an excellent idea. Okay, enough with slavery. Religion slash Christianity. Pretty much anybody with a Christian background, which includes all of the people coming from the cultures where Christianity or any other Abrahamic religion were dominant or still dominant up to this day. So yeah, all of these people pay more attention to Christianity than it deserves, including myself. There can be good reasons for that. There can be bad. The roots of Abrahamic religions can be seen in antiquity, that's true, but centuries of dominance of Christianity produced a huge amount of works of very, very, very debatable authenticity that paint the pictures of how important Christianity was and how lots of Christian adjacent stuff happened. And it traveled into Christian history books, to mass culture, everywhere. So authors like to follow Christian, or in general Abrahamic, myths and work with this material, think about this material, discuss what could have happened if some religious figures never existed, or if persecutions of Christians took an unexpected turn or something along these lines. And they don't approach sources, especially religious sources, critically, and don't even think about approaching them critically. This is how we get this stuff with crucifixions in the 20th century on metal crosses. It attracts attention, it potentially affects sales, but historically speaking, that's just insane. As I've said before, even a good author like Robert Silverberg uses this failed escape of Moses from Egypt as one of the points of divergence. And then he has one more point of divergence with Muhammad. This is fun, but that's simply not serious from the historical perspective, because you're dealing with mythology and pretend that mythological events actually took place. Now, you can obviously be more critical of the sources, or you can be less critical. You can be more revisionistic or less. But even if you're not super skeptical, figures like Moses never existed. That's just a fact. There was no exodus from Egypt. It's a weird point of divergence. Jesus Christ is not a historical figure, although you can successfully debate that he had a certain prototype. All of the early popes of Rome are made up characters together with all the early Christian martyrs. All of the early Christian communities, like from the first or second centuries AD, well, we don't really know much about them. And if you're critical of the sources, you can easily make a case that there are no Christians in the first or second centuries. Probably not even in the third, especially since there is no material evidence. Nero couldn't persecute Christians because there was nobody to persecute. And this information from Tacitus should be treated with caution. We'll talk about Tacitus at some point. I should make a video on his annals. What about horrific persecutions of Christians by Diocletian in the 3rd century? Well, it is not even mentioned in the non religious sources. It probably never happened at all. It is a Christian myth. But authors just ignore all of these complications. People speculate about this, and most of the time they are not even aware of the fact that they are making conclusions based on, a book of Eusebius or something like that, which is either an unreliable source, if you're conservative with the sources, or an anti-source, if you're a skeptic. When I say anti-source, I mean a deliberate falsification of events, making stuff up. It's a bit like we're discussing alternate history and trying to imagine what could have happened if Romulus never existed. He was the first king of Rome, the founder of the city. What if there was no Romulus? Well, that's a bad point of divergence if you're serious about the historical aspect. Because Romulus is a mythological character, raised by the she-wolf, born from a Vestal virgin, son of Mars. At a certain point, he disappeared and became a god, Quirinus to be precise. But he is mentioned in historical sources. Titus Livy, Cassius Dio. Well, yeah, he's mentioned. He has a biography, good for him. Theseus also has a biography. He even had a grave in Athens. It probably makes sense to conclude this segment about religion by pointing out that Romans had their own religion and numerous cults. Some of them were not really Roman or just syncretic. Usually, authors simplify this aspect or don't understand it at all. They just know that there is a polytheistic religion, there is a Jupiter and Minerva, and they all hate Christians for no reason. That's a very dumbed down version of the religious practices in Rome and very misleading. Sometimes an outright projection of the principles of the Abrahamic religions on a non Abrahamic religion. Also, a religion without unified sacred books telling you the only definitive story how this or that god was born and what exactly he said. And a religion where a significant part of the society just thought that, it's all nice fairy tales and that's it. Marcus Aurelius once said, well, provided that his meditations are authentic. So Marcus Aurelius once said basically that I am not sure if gods actually exist. And Marcus Aurelius, obviously, held the title of Pontifex Maximus. He was the head of the Roman religion. And the head of Roman religion wasn't sure if there were any gods at all. Sports. Yes, I'd like to emphasize sports once again. I've done it like 10 times already in different videos because it is kind of important. It instantly reveals the level of understanding of antiquity the author has. It shows how committed they are to the idea of following the outdated concepts and the blueprints of the mass culture. I'll try to be very short this time. Depiction of gladiatorial combat in modern works of fiction is universally wrong and puts into the minds of the audience harmful stereotypes that distort the perception of ancient Rome. It's something like making a film about professional wrestling in the United States or about football in, well, anywhere, and telling people that, it was a terrible massacre, piles of corpses, and it shows how depraved and barbaric the particular country which held these events was. It is either a deep misunderstanding of the culture or a shameless propaganda, a Goebbels style, North Korean style, or, well, American style these days. But authors just stick to this weird and outdated idea and keep telling you grotesque stories which have nothing to do with the reality. Some authors even go as far as saying that if Rome was still around, gladiatorial combat, where participants are deliberately killing each other, would have survived even in the 20th century. When in reality, it wasn't the case even in the 1st century BC. Okay, time to wrap everything up. We've discussed 5 major problems, major groups of misconceptions that people repeat over and over again. This is the moment when I should say something like, let me know in the comments how Rome might have evolved if the crisis of the 3rd century never happened, in a desperate attempt to feed the YouTube algorithm and become a star and start selling t-shirts and mugs. Am I really interested in all these theories about the alternate Rome? Uh, to be honest, not really. As I said, it is useful for analysis, but uh, in any case, we're gonna end up with the 3rd century and the search for the real causes of the long term crisis. And the most interesting reasons, unfortunately, can only be heard when people start putting forward conspiracy theories in attempts to explain this monstrous, unbelievable cultural decline. It's as if a massive nuclear strike had been launched against the whole Mediterranean. If I were writing a book in the alternate history genre, I'd probably try to play it safe. For example, I would imagine a situation where, as a result of a conspiracy against Nero, Seneca becomes the emperor. He would probably be a transitional ruler like Nerva. But in fact, that's why it is interesting. Thank you for watching, and don't forget, to subscribe and stuff.